Science of Astrology. Quick poll first. Anybody here already an astrologer? Okay, cool. Anybody sort of think, yeah, I think there's something in it? Thank you. Okay, cool. Anybody sort of skeptical, but I'm open. Fabulous. Anybody think it's a load of rubbish? Okay, cool. That's great. I just wanted to know who I was talking to. In this presentation, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the difference between astrology and astronomy, and a little description of what natural astrology is. And then I'm going to give you a brief history of astrology, and then we're going to talk about the memory of water. And then if we have time and anybody's willing, we're going to do a little demonstration. So first of all, this is me. I started off doing biochemistry, and then I did a PhD in Leicester in biophysics. And I went on to do a teaching qualification as well. And then a few years later, I dropped out, 7 years at uni. I dropped out, I went traveling, it wasn't for me. And I ended up spending 7 years doing a diploma in astrological counselling and learning various other healing modalities as well. And then I went back to art college. I went to art college because that's really what I wanted to do at 16. But because I was clever, I was told I had to do science. So I went to art college for 4 years in Macclesfield, best thing I ever did. And just before lockdown started, I was what they call a citizen scientist. So I was going out and, using my own financial resources to go out and do research. And my thing was microplastics. I was part of a team of women who sailed all the way around the UK looking at microplastics in UK coastal waters. And then I did my own expedition, canoeing down the Leeds-Liverpool Canal, sampling for microplastics in there. And then my samples, because as a scientist, I used to be a microscopist. I did electron microscopy, that was my thing, of muscle filaments. And so there was this lab in Edinburgh that was open for just ordinary citizens to go in and use it. And I went up there and used their polarizing microscope to take photographs of my microplastics. So that's one of the images that I got. I've had a few publications. I was, one of those kids that was just like really clever and bored to tears, so, and I was always making mistakes as a scientist. That's one reason I left. I actually got a paper in Nature. And I was working on myosin filaments. We were looking at the structure of myosin filaments, and I made a mistake. My boss came over and he said, "What have you done?" "I don't know. You made a mistake. What have you done?" And I had to go through what I'd done. And he said, "Wow, you've done it. You proved it. They've got 3 subfilaments." And I was like, oh, okay. Anyway, yeah. So had numerous articles. And after I left science and retrained complementary therapies, I learned how to make flower essences. I'll go into those in a bit in the future. And I had a whole big range, and they got published in this book as well. So the difference between astronomy and astrology. So astronomy is where you use big telescopes and you're looking at where the planets and the stars are, and you're calculating their movement. And you're looking into deep space. Astrology is about the relationships that the planets in our solar system make to each other. So in the same way that a full moon, you've got the sun and the moon and they're opposite each other, or you could have a quarter moon and they're at right angles to each other. So all the other planets make these angles to each other as well. And that's what astrology is about. It's about understanding those relationships that they make to each other, and what do they mean to us on Earth? What do they mean to life on Earth? And until the sort of mid-1700s, there was no distinction between astronomy and astrology. It was exactly the same thing, and everybody had to study it. If you were a learned scholar, you wanted to do medicine or law or anything, you have to be an astrologer. So let's have a quick look at what you actually believe. You believe that events just happen at random. Maybe there is a God and we're just puppets. Or the planets are so far away, how can they possibly influence us? And there is a God punishing us when we're bad. And I'm just grateful when something good happens. Everything is connected. So if you're into quantum mechanics and you're into Einstein's work and all that, you know that everything is one energy. Everything is connected. There is no separation. And if a butterfly flaps in one place, it's affecting something on the other side of the planet. We've all heard that. Yeah, so everything is connected. We can't look at the planets and just think, oh, there's something out there and then nothing to do with us. And we are each completely unique, irrespective of circumstances. Take twins. You know, they can be completely different, even though they're only born 10, 15 minutes apart and being brought up in the same family. And we each have our own energy blueprint, our own biorhythm. We're all completely different. And this blueprint, this biorhythm, can be mapped and show your potentialities. So, brief history of astrology. Well, you know, up until whatever, you know, the old ancients, they, you know, what else did they have to do at night? They'd sit by the fire and they'd look at the stars. And the planets were called planets because they were the wandering stars. So they were aware that there were a lot of fixed stars. Yes, they'd move as the night went on, but they realized that there were these other bodies in the sky that would actually move in front of them and would be always moving. And of course, you know, the Neolithics, they built these huge stone circles which were like calendars. They were a bit like clocks. So, you know, they believed that Stonehenge actually maps out the path of the eclipses now. And as I said, up until the mid 1700s, 1800s, sorry, I've got confused now, 1700, you had to study astrology in order to, you know, be, you know, held in regard in your field. And Isaac Newton, Galileo, Plato, they were all astrologers. And then the printing press took over, came in. And suddenly they were printing out loads of astrological leaflets and putting them out, disseminating them into the wider public. And people loved them. And they would go, oh, you know, like, you know, they would use them as predictions, and, you know, and they started sort of like, you know, basing everything on the predictions that they saw in their leaflets. And this actually started to become a bit of a problem for the church. But in those days, up until they started printing ephemerises, which are the books that have all the positions of the planets. So, you know, an ephemeris every day, you can look across and see where all the planets are at, you know, on that particular day. When they started printing those, then it became easier to draw a birth chart. But up until that point, in order to have your birth chart calculated, you needed a lot of money, because the scientist who was doing it for you had to actually go out and measure where the stars were. They had to be really clever. So it wasn't done as a general thing. And then there was in the late 1700s, things changed, and science and religion became separate. And the church was like, we can't have all these people, you know, like looking at bits of astrology on paper, you know, we need them to come back to the church, and, you know, and it's God that rules, and we can't have this. And all this went on around the same time that Uranus was discovered. So up until the first telescopes, they didn't know beyond Saturn, because Saturn was the only wandering star they could see, the furthest one. And then when Galileo's, or whoever it was, had the telescope, and they saw this other planet beyond Saturn. Well, that blew their minds. And in a way, that's what Uranus is all about, because at the same time, they discovered electricity, started, using understanding about telegraph, and and it was like the whole. Imagine up until 250 years ago, the human species believed that Saturn was the boundary of our universe. And Saturn represented boundaries. It represents our skin. It represented death. There was no beyond Saturn. And so suddenly to have this other planet, it was like an expansion of consciousness, an expansion of awareness. And Uranus is very much about that. Now, the church were like, no, astrology, load of rubbish, not having that anymore. You're not allowed to practice that. And, many Christians believe now that's the work of the devil. I've been told I'm not allowed to mention the word astrology in my sister's house because it's the work of the devil. But equally, they cannot deny that the moon affects the tides, that the moon affects water, that the sun affects the seasons. So that was then classed as natural astrology, and that was okay. But anything beyond that, in fact, that it might affect human psyche, or it might affect politics or whatever, no, not going there. And then in the late 19th century, there was this upswell of this metaphysical movement. You may have heard of Dame Blavatsky and the Golden Dawn. And this came about at the same time they discovered Neptune. Now, Neptune is all about, it's like a different level of expanded consciousness. It's about unity. It's about where everything merges and everything becomes one. It has almost like a religious, spiritual sort of connotation to it. And this was discovered at the same time that suddenly people became much more interested in non-religious spirituality, if you like, in this country. I'm not talking about the East, I'm talking about in Europe. Then in the 1930s, we had the first astrology columns in newspapers. They were just like a piece of entertainment. They weren't meant to be taken seriously. And Princess Margaret was the last royal to have her chart read and publicly displayed. You could go and read her chart reading. After that, it wasn't done anymore. And around that time, Pluto was discovered. And Pluto was, at the same time that Pluto was discovered, they discovered nuclear power. And certainly Pluto is also, I'll go into this one second, but Pluto is very much about destructive energy. So maybe I should say here that as far as I see, that everything works at a whole spectrum, from the very unconscious, like Pluto is, literally nuclear wipeout destruction, to the very conscious, where for me, Pluto is about the will of God. And it's about, what am I being asked to do? How do I channel myself so that I am co-creating with the universe? So for me, everything works on a spectrum, and it really depends on how awake or asleep we are as to whether we're listening to how we are being guided and how we're being asked to work with the planets. And then late 90s, coming up 2000, America finally, they removed the law that you weren't allowed to practice astrology. You used to get huge fines for practicing astrology. It was considered, equivalent to, like witchcraft and things like that. And also, within better telescopes, they realized that, and you probably all heard this, that Pluto's not really a planet, is actually part of the Kuiper Belt objects. And they've now found a whole load of other Kuiper Belt objects with orbits very, very, I mean, Pluto already has an orbit of 250 years, and they've found objects now that have, orbits, more like 400 years. And one of them, I can't remember the name, very interesting because it has a very, very elliptical orbit. And at the moment, it's as near to Earth as it can get, but it takes 12,000 years or something to go all the way around. And at its furthest, it touches the very boundary of the universe as we currently know it, as far as we have been able to currently see it. So it's very interesting that, the astrologers are talking about this planet that, has been all the way out there, right to the boundary of our universe, and now has come all the way into our orbit, our field, if you like. So for me, this is all interrelated with water. And when I started learning how to make flower essences in the late 80s, I became very interested in water. Now, D.H. Lawrence even said, look, we know that water is H2O, two hydrogen and one oxygen, but there's a third thing about water that nobody knows what it is. Now, you think about it, our bodies, 80 kilo body, 56 kilos of it is water. Like if we were in a bottle, we'd just be sloshing about. And of all our molecules in our body, 99% are water. We're basically beings of water. And we don't really tend to think about that very much. Now, we all know there's 3 states of water: gas, liquid, and solid. And water, as you probably know, is very, very unique as a substance. And it's partly because it's such a tiny molecule and it's ionized. Yeah, it's got a positive and a negative end to it. One of the things that makes it really unique is that the solid, ice, is actually less dense than the liquid, which means that ice floats. And therefore, the waters of lakes and things can freeze and everything underneath can still stay alive. And we all know that ice has like a 6-fold symmetry. We see snowflakes, we know that pattern. So I'm going to now go through a very brief synopsis of the research on water since 1988 at a quantum level. And I'd like to talk first about the memory of water. Water's ability to store and transmit energy patterns. In 1988, Dr. Jacques Benveniste, the French scientist, had a paper published in Nature called The Memory of Water. Now, he'd already had 5 papers published in Nature. They knew him. He was a very well-respected scientist. So they just took his paper and published it. At that time, I'd already given up science and I was getting into making my flower essences. But my best friend, who we'd done our PhDs at the same time, had become a sub-editor at Nature. And so, of course, I was like really excited to all this paper you've published, The Memory of Water, blah, blah. And she said, oh, no, actually, we sent a team out to his lab with John Maddox, the editor of Nature, and a magician, and somebody else who's good at testing for hoaxes, and it's all a load of rubbish. We're refuting the whole paper. And I was like, well, it seems pretty straight on to me. It fits for me in terms of, the interest I was developing in flower essences and homeopathy and astrology. You know what? She wrote to me, she said, I never want to be your friend again. That was it, gone. And he died not long afterwards. He literally got thrown out of his lab and ended up working in a porter cabin. And then this guy, Dr. Luc Montagnier, who had won a Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV virus, decided to pick up on his work. And he died not long afterwards too. And now, has anybody here heard of Dr. Masaru Emoto? No? Okay. Right. You have. Great. So what he did, he was looking, he would take like 2 glasses of water, and one he would send blessings to or prayers to, or he'd put a little note on the water saying, I love you, or thank you. And then the other one, he would say, I hate you, or, you know, whatever, you're an idiot. And then he semi-froze the water and looked at the water crystals. And he found that whenever the water was blessed or given good information, he got these beautiful 6-sided crystals, a little bit like snowflakes. And whenever he sort of like said, you know, I hate you, or blah, 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 then it was disorganized chaos. Now, he also died quite a few years ago, but his work is now being taken up by Veda Austin. And Emoto also did an experiment with rice that's quite famous, where he had 3 jars of rice, and he put rice in each jar, put some water in, and for several weeks, he just said thank you to one jar, I hate you to the other jar, and left the other jar alone. And after a few weeks, the jar he said thank you to, it was fermented, but it was smelling sweet, and he felt he could have actually eaten it. The jar he said, I hate you, was black and disgusting. And the one that he ignored was sort of somewhere in between. And then in 2013, this guy, Dr. Gerald Pollack, was working with water. And he was looking at what happened. He had water against a hydrophilic, which means water-loving membrane. And because, you know, obviously with increasing technology, you know, increasing little electrodes, you know, all that sort of stuff, he discovered that what happened was next to that layer, that hydrophilic layer, there was a layer of water that had a more gel-like consistency. And it also had a charge. And also, which I haven't drawn on here, but it excluded anything that was, any particulate matter that was in the water. And so he called it EZ water, or Americans easy water, which means the exclusion zone water. And what they discovered was that in this area, the water was forming these hexagonal layers, hexagonal configurations, which were sitting in layers. Now, this thickness is very thin, you know, it's like less than the thickness of a hair. But, you know, nowadays, increased detection methods, you know, that's still quite big at the quantum level. So and they called it the 4th phase of water. And I'm now going to call it structured water, but it's all called EZ, or hexagonal, coherent, crystalline. So what makes structured water special? Well, one, it's got a slightly different chemical formula. It's H3O2, which obviously therefore makes it more ionized than ordinary water. And it embodies the golden ratio. Who knows? Hands up if you know what the golden ratio is. I'm going to tell you what it is, but just interesting. Yeah, not many people know what the golden ratio is. So you will, once you see that diagram, because you'll all probably have heard of Fibonacci series, and you'll all know about the ratio of phi, and you'll all know that, you know, that spirals are built on this special ratio, yeah? And Leonardo da Vinci, you know, his Vitruvius Man was on this. It's everything. All the, you know, the proportions in our hands, the proportion of our faces, the proportion of our bodies is all in this ratio. And artists discovered sort of like in the 1500s about this ratio and realized that, you know, whenever you're making a picture, you need to put your subject on one of the points of the golden ratio, which is roughly sort of thirds. The inner third is a bit smaller than the outer third. And because as humans, when we see something that is in that proportion, it makes us feel good. There's a sort of an aesthetic quality about it that we resonate with, and it makes us feel good. And of course, it's found throughout the plant kingdom, in sunflower seeds and daisies and all that sort of thing. I liked this quote. This is a scientist who works in the UK, and she's written a book called The Rainbow and the Wormhole. And she says the golden ratio orchestrates all of nature's cycles. And water exists as clusters based on the golden ratio, the magic number woven into the fabric of the universe and consciousness. And I came across this little quote, which I thought was really interesting, because that was like 2.5, nearly 3,000 years ago. Water is the principal factor creating nature. I'm not going to try and repeat his name because I have no idea how you say it. And it really got me thinking. Well, I actually was given the idea by a film I saw, but it really made me think, that is the golden ratio that is embodied in water the driving force, the impetus for life, in the sense that life is also built on this golden ratio. And certainly there's some debate, I'm not going to have an argument about it, but if you read the Bible, it doesn't say in there, and God created water. So, it suggests that water already existed. Now, we know that water comes from out in the universe. That's where it comes from. So just interesting. I'm not saying any of this is true. But structured water does exist in what we call untamed water sources. So springs and waterfalls, glacier melt, rains and oceans, and in healthy cells. That is definitely known now, that we have structured water in our cells. And that life can be defined as an ability for an organism to maintain what's called its liquid crystallinity. And it implies that there's living water and there's something other than living water. And I saw another quote which said that one of the reasons we age is because our proportion of living water starts to decrease. Our proportion of structured water starts to decrease. Can water lose its life? If so, can it be returned? I think we come across Dr. Zach Bush. Oh, awesome. You really should look him up on YouTube. He's incredible. And he says that the memory of water is actually held within the crystalline structure of water. And have you ever wondered why, have you ever anybody been to Greece or Turkey or somewhere like that? Yeah. And they have those amphora-shaped vessels, and that's where everything was stored. The grain was stored, the water was stored, the wine was stored. And often they'd be buried in the ground, and sometimes they'd be huge. Why have that shape? Because it helps to maintain the crystallinity, the structure of water. Because the way that we can return structure to water is one way is to put it in a spiral. So if you think about water, like, when it's flowing naturally in a river or something like that, it's moving, isn't it? It's spiraling. And there was an Austrian forester at the turn of the last century called Albert Schroeder or something like that. I can't remember. Yeah. And he studied the flow of water because he wanted to know how you could transport logs more easily down rivers and things. And what he found was that water works best when it's curling in like this. That is what keeps water healthy. That's right. It's called imploded water. Yeah. And that water is best when it's spiraling. So unfortunately, most of the water that we drink comes through straight pipes. Worse, it goes through right angles. And so by the time it comes out of our tap, irrespective of whatever chemicals have been put into it, it's pretty dead. It's not living water anymore. And, you know, I've got loads of friends who will drink bottled spring water because, you know, it's not got chemicals in it. But the thing is, it's dead in there as well. It needs to be moving. It needs to be fluid. Yes, like from springs, directly from the spring. And in these shapes, it naturally has this spiraling movement. So is water the ultimate carrier of information? Now, I've done quite a lot of research because up until recently, I hadn't seen any research that had been done since all these guys had died. It was like nothing had happened since. And so I really started deep diving, you know, in Google and looking what was going on now. And I found two different things. One, that they're looking now at how they can actually generate electricity from water by squeezing it between plates. So basically creating structured water because it's a really fine layer of water. And as a data storage medium. Now, this is really interesting. So, very new, what they discovered is that, and these are electronics people, okay? These are not biologists. And because they can now, you know, look at the molecular structure of water, and they can look at that quantum level now, what they discovered was that, say you have a jar of water and you're working on that, and you have a jar of water and you're working on that, and you have a jar of water and you're working on that, that at the quantum structural level, those three jars are all completely different, irrespective of the fact you've all done the same thing to them, and that every jar of water that you work with, every jar you work with, every jar you work with, has the same pattern consistently. So they can actually take a jar of water, look at it at that atomic level and know who worked with that water. You know, in terms of security and data storage and stuff like that, you know, that we each have our own imprint in water. So anyway, that's really new. I've not seen it refuted anywhere. If you go in, you know, like Wikipedia and talk about the memory of water, they just say it's pseudoscience. A flower essence, I used to make these, is basically a little jar of water, a little bowl of water, float some flowers on it, put it out underneath the sun for a few hours, take the flowers off, and then preserve that water with some brandy. And you just dilute it once or twice. Have everybody come across things like Rescue Remedy? I mean, they sell it in Boots. Yeah, you've all heard of Rescue. That's a flower essence, or a combination of flower essences. Homeopathy is slightly different. It's where you actually take a substance, dissolve it in water, and you give it a really good old shake. Take one drop out, put it in another liter of water, give it a good old shake, and you keep doing this repeatedly until there are no molecules of that substance left in the water. All you've got is the energy pattern of that substance left. And, you know, because we can now measure our electromagnetic fields really easily, you know, you can, a flower essence can change our electromagnetic field in 30 seconds. And the other thing we're looking at is that DNA is like a fractal antenna in electromagnetic fields. A fractal antenna means that it's got two bits, but one, it can conduct and it emits radiation. And the thing about DNA is that it will pick up radiation on a very wide electromagnetic scale. from, you know, absolute subtle to really damaging, and we all know about damaging ionizing rays and things, but also that it has self-symmetry. And what that means is if you take a small portion of the DNA, it's like a hologram. It's just part, it looks the same as the whole thing. So it's just a repeating unit, if you like. So we've got DNA that is acting like an antenna. It's picking up on electromagnetic radiation. It's picking up on the electromagnetic radiation fields around us. And, you know, we are electromagnetic bodies, but we live in a sea of electromagnetic radiation. And that's not even counting, you know, mobile phones and things like that. You know, just, you know, even prior all that lot, even, you know, ancient people lived in a electromagnetic field. And planets, comets, everything out there all emits electromagnetic frequencies, which is what they're detecting on the telescopes. Yeah, you know, we're not using telescopes anymore, you know, that just are collecting light. Nowadays, all the telescopes are picking up on microwave radiation. Yeah, it's like, you know, and that's why we can just see further and further and further. But the planets emit mainly infrared radiation, which is what the sun emits. Yeah. Now, remember I said about the sun, you know, the full moon. We know, I don't think anybody's going to argue with me, that the moon, when it's full, it's because the sun and the moon are directly opposite each other, and the whole face of the moon is reflecting the sun's light. Would you all agree with me?
Yes.
That that's what's happening? Yeah. Yeah. So when it's a quarter moon, the sun is hitting it sideways, but because we're seeing it from the front, we only see half of it illuminated. So all of the planets are moving, and they all move roughly in one elliptic. It's not a three-dimensional thing like electrons around an atom. They tend to move in one plane around our sun. And they all move at different speeds. So as they're moving, they're opposite each other, or they're at right angles to each other, and they're all emitting radiation. So presumably, they are also impacting each other. And, you know, Earth was sitting there in the middle somewhere. And because everything is one, then we must be somehow we must be impacted by these movements and by this radiation as they form different angles in the same way that we're impacted by the sun and the moon. So my hypothesis, and this is my hypothesis, it's what I believed ever since I came across Jack Benveniste paper. But now with all this new information, I'm like, I really think there's something in this. When we're born, our lungs are full of liquid, and it's naturally absorbed by our lungs. But as we're born, you know, baby goes like this and takes a huge breath, which I've Googled how much air is it taking, what's the percentage of moisture in the air, and I've calculated that in that huge breath of air, there's about 5 drops of water. Now, that water is the first external stimuli that baby has had. Up until that point, all its water was from its mother, okay? But that's its first external input. And so this water is like in a state of being electromagnetically ionized or whatever by the current positions of the planets and the universe that are going on at the moment. And we know that water transmits energy, that transmits information, because we've already seen that. And so my understanding is those first few drops, they basically imprint on all the water in the baby's body. And although that water will change over time, because obviously we're all living in the atmosphere and we're all getting radiated all the time, there is a memory of that original imprint. And at certain times, that memory is triggered by whatever is happening out there. When, you know, it makes a specific location and it's going to go boom, like this on the memory that we have in our own water. And is it on that bit? No. So we've got this DNA acting like an antenna. Possibly it's the DNA that's picking up on this electromagnetic frequency, or it could be the fact that each DNA molecule is literally encrusted in thousands and thousands of structured water molecules. Okay, so, and we also know that one of the things that water really likes is to be hit by light. So it's really good to get out in the sun, get lots of sunlight. That helps to structure water. And so this electromagnetic radiation hits the water around the DNA, or the DNA picks up on the electromagnetic radiation, whatever, and it sets up a frequency, a vibration in the water. And this was new to me, but I read it somewhere that that frequency, that vibration is unique to all of us and could be what we associate as self-awareness. Because my sense of self is completely different to your sense of self. Completely different to your sense of self. We each have a unique sense of self-awareness. And if everything is energy, then it sort of suggests that it could be to do with our own energy patterns, our own energy vibration. So I've just done this sort of little diagram. Can you see it? Oh, yes, you can. So there's the DNA covered in water molecules. It's got the sun or the planets, whatever, radiating down on it. And that little map at the top is the example of the map of the sky, of the heavens at the moment that somebody was born. Exactly where all the planets were in the sky. And so we could call it a frequency map because it's all about our own inner frequency, our own personality, but it's also called a birth chart or a horoscope, star map, or a natal chart. And this one is mine. So on the left where it says AC, that represents what was rising on the eastern horizon at the time I was born. It's really important to know the time because we need to know whether the planets were up there or whether they were down there. So if you go across, if you make a line across between AC and DC, that's like the horizon. And everything above it was visible in the sky and everything below it was not visible in the sky. This band of colored symbols are the symbols that represent the constellations of the zodiac. And then these little symbols inside, each of those represents the planets. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that there are planets and that when you look at them, they sit in front of a constellation. And so so basically, that is like a map of the heavens at the moment that I was born. And the colored line, so the long red line, that represents the opposition, like the sun, you know, when there's full moon. And the short red lines, they represent a square, like on a quarter moon. And the long blue lines, they represent 120 degrees, and I haven't got any short blue lines. And the long green line represents 150 degrees.